Alright, hey there folks, this is Dan Fagella, and today in this CLV Boost tutorial, we're going to talk about regimenting your email content in a way that doesn't imply having to rethink your email content. A lot of folks struggle with getting out regular, educational, quality newsletters in a way that isn't a nuisance to them, in a way that doesn't feel like another kind of racking of the brain. And today we're going to talk about how to repurpose a lot of your other content and encouraging content regimens across other categories of content that basically make putting together a newsletter sort of a snap and make it relatively simple to week over week create useful and valuable educational newsletter content that you can mix in with your offers and other sorts of materials to stay in the inbox and continuously drive traffic with your subscribership without having to rethink, oh goodness, what's this week's newsletter going to be about? Oh goodness, what's this month's newsletter going to be about? It doesn't matter what your email cadence is. Today we're going to talk about concepts that'll apply either way. Essentially, the main brunt of what we'll speak about today, I'm going to use the color orange for this little funny whiteboard that we'll be going into, is that whatever other content regimens you're involved in, you can essentially repurpose those into newsletters or broadcasts, and oftentimes you won't even do most of the repurposing. So for example, you might be engaged in some or more of these content types in a given week. Okay, so I have one particular business where I do it's actually a podcast and an interview. I do one of those per week. I have another business where I do one video per week in that particular business. I know folks that on a monthly basis will do webinars, and there's some folks that put up a new video every single Monday and Wednesday, whatever the case may be. For me, it's really just on Mondays that I'm doing this at present. Whatever your given regimens are for this content, the ideal is to be able to transfer this kind of content into other sorts of written content which can then be transferred into newsletters. And we'll talk about exactly how to pull that off. So let's say, for example, you're me in one of my given LLCs here, and you are, that orange doesn't show up too well. Let's get a nice yellow out here maybe. You write one or you create one new video per week, sort of like this, right? It's actually exactly like this. I create one educational video along these lines per week. Now, I can pay someone to take this video, like the video I'm filming right now, or other videos, and use it to be repurposed and turned into blog content. So someone listening to this video right now who is an employee of CLV Boost doesn't necessarily have to be an email marketing expert in order to put together a pretty darn good article about a well-done step-by-step guide video, because they're essentially sort of taking the transcript and the concepts that I'm saying and articulating them again in well-formed words, paragraphs, sentences, sections, etc., and turning it into blog content. So once a week, I actually do this myself. I'll have the main educational video that I filmed transformed into one or more blog articles. So in case you're not already doing this, if you're filming a video willy-nilly when you feel like it, and you're writing blogs willy-nilly when you feel like it, you can expect to be pumping out newsletters willy-nilly like you feel like it, whenever you feel like it. So you can expect them to, again, not be regular and not be all that well orchestrated, because the rest of your content isn't. So one of the main points I want to drive home today is that if you're having trouble churning out emails on a consistent basis, I would ask, do you have systems in place to churn out the rest of your content in a consistent basis? If you don't, I recommend people start here before they even get here. And we'll talk about that in the repurposing process, but this is all part of sort of the business rigor that you implement. So for CLV Boost, for example, once a week I'll film a video, and then I will pay someone to turn that video into a well-done article. And I can potentially also pay them to turn it into a well-done guest post, which might combine multiple videos, or it might just have to do with the given last video that I had filmed, as an example. All right. We can take similar related long-form blog posts on a particular topic and bundle those together to create guides and white papers. And we can use these to entice email opt-ins and all sorts of fun other marketing tactics that we can sort of implement there with really good content. But essentially, a video once a week in a religious regimen of the same exact time and day. So these videos are filmed the week before, and then they're posted up on Monday the following week. So that's how we do those. At the same time, when the video is posted, a blog is written about it, and then at the same time a blog is written about it, we'll pump out an email about it. So we can take this blog content and we can now repurpose it as newsletters. So we'll talk about these other bits of content in just a second here. We can take this blog content and turn it into newsletters. Now you might be asking yourself, well, you know, how are you going to take a blog and necessarily use it as a newsletter? It doesn't always really work like that. Well, that's right. You can't exactly just copy your whole 1,000 word blog post and slam it into your email and press the send button. But instead, you can repurpose and recycle different segments or sections of the actual blog post. So let's talk about that. Recycling titles, headlines from other content. So check this out. Once a week, I'll film a video. Okay, this video I will personally title. I'll personally title this video something enticing, informative, educational. Normally, again, really honing in on what this video actually does, how people could be benefited by tuning in to this particular video. So once a week, I'll create that video and I'll create the headline. That same title of this video can be used as the subject line of the email. The same title of the video can be used as the subject line of the email because we're using the email to drive to this blog post, which has this video embedded in it. If you're hearing about this video from my own newsletter, you're probably seeing it in this exact format. You're seeing me write a newsletter that sends to a blog post that has an embedded video where basically all I did was this part, and the rest of it could actually be done by someone else. Because it almost doesn't involve that much creativity. It's part of a rigorous process of consistently taking great educational content and driving it across multiple channels. So I'll take the same great title that I use for this video, use it as a subject line. I can also use the same lead-in. So I can use the same, let's say, 3, 4, 5 sentences that I use in this very video. In other words, the one you're listening to right now, the one you're watching right now, and I can have that essentially be transcribed by whoever's doing the email newsletter writing and put that as the lead-in to the email. So the way that I tee up this video to explain why it's going to be helpful for folks and what they're going to get out of it, wouldn't that be basically exactly the same notion that I would want to convey in an email? I think it would be. So oftentimes the exact same lead-in addition to the title being reused as a subject line in the email, the lead-in for the video, in other words, my audio, my spoken word, can be turned into text and used as a text lead-in, which again doesn't involve creativity, doesn't involve that much rethinking. From there, we can recycle images. Oftentimes in my newsletter broadcasts, we'll put in images. Instead of going, oh shucks, I got to scratch my chin and go over to Google Images and yada yada. Instead of doing that, why don't I take the same images that I embedded in my blog post? By the same manner, why don't I take images that are screenshots of the video content or the webinar content that I filmed or a picture that I used on my podcast about my particular podcast episode, whatever the case may be. We'll talk about doing this with podcasts and webinars in just a second. I'm running with videos for the time being. So I can use the same image and I can embed that image. So instead of having to rethink, oh, what kind of image is going to work well in this email? What do I put in this email? Content-wise, the title, the lead-in, the image can really all be based off of this one video and or whatever was built in this blog post. And then we can take blog snippets, one or multiple, to create the newsletter. So in one example, we would use a blog snippet of simply one given blog or article. In another example, we might use multiples. So let's see exactly what that looks like in real time. So if I'm here and we're examining one example of an email that I wrote not all that long ago, okay? So the subject line, this is for my emerging technology media site called Tech Emergence. This says, AI evolving advertising and an interview with a cyborg. So an interesting subject line, right? Interesting subject line. Essentially, I have a brief little lead-in, which was similar to the lead-in that we used on a This Week in Artificial Intelligence article. And then I've taken the major headlines from my This Week in Artificial Intelligence article, and I've put those as the segments that I'm referencing in my particular newsletter. I'm using the same images I used in my blog in my newsletter. I'm just truncating these paragraphs. I'm making them shorter and then linking people directly to the sections or directly to the article that they were gleaned from. Similarly, We did. Where's my interview here? So I have an interview with Chris Hables Gray was our guest in this particular episode. So I used the same headline that I used for the article, and then similarly, or a variation of the same headline I used in the article, I use a little tiny snippet of the same introduction that we use for the podcast, and I just link them to the blog that we use in the podcast. So I'm sort of conglomerating all of the same information that I was using beforehand and sort of bundling it all together. Using two blogs in this case. One is called This Week in AI, and one is our podcast blog post, and just crunching them together into one well-formed email that we could just send out using the same content and informing people in a useful way. If we're only using one article, this one actually doesn't involve any pictures. This is an older email here. This says the subject is decrease conversion friction and make more sales online. This is the exact subject line, I believe, from one of our own YouTube videos. And as you can see, this week's tutorial will be talking about decreasing conversion friction, yada yada. We link directly to the article itself. See the full tutorial this week. And then there's a truncated version of some of the initial bullet points of the article. So we're briefly going into what's in the article. Basically, taking the article, slicing away 90% of it, trying to come up with a really solid representative chunk that our folks can really glean something from, and at the same time might tease them into wanting to learn more and wanting to read the entire article. And we link to the article again at the bottom. So these are useful emails that are sent out on a rigorous and consistent basis because my videos and because my blogs are being put out in a rigorous and consistent basis. Same thing up here with articles and podcasts. We're using a podcast, which is turned into an article, and we're using another longer This Week in AI article, and we're repurposing those, truncating the content, using the same lead-in for the podcast interview as we did in the actual podcast article itself, and conglomerating that into one email as well. So recycling the same content over in order to reuse it. And in that sense, we don't have to rethink and rack our brains for great email content. If your other rich content and written content regimens are on point, you should very much be able to generate rich and educational newsletter content without really very much hassle at all. Same thing with the podcast. If you do a podcast or an interview, once per week, let's say, or maybe your email newsletters are once a month. Maybe you're in a very professional niche where you really don't want to be in the inbox too much. Maybe you're something that we jokingly call boring industries like insurance or legal or something, where you really don't send out very many emails, but you still want to stay top of mind as a thought leader. Maybe you do an interview or you do an educational webinar about tax law, for all I know. In which case, every time you do a monthly webinar, you could very easily have somebody write a guest post on another legal website, or write a post on your own blog, which I certainly recommend, about the content of that webinar and exactly the major points you covered, and some useful takeaways that anybody listening in or tuned into that webinar could be able to learn from. Or maybe you just take 2 or 3 of the, let's say, 6 ideas that you cover in the webinar, and you write a really great blog post about it. Whatever the webinar was called, you might be able to reuse that same title for your subject line when you delegate the job of email, if you're delegating, or if you do it yourself just to reduce your thinking. Or you could take the same title of your blog and reuse that as the subject line. Generally, if you are delegating the blog to someone else and you're just doing the webinar, I like to have the webinar's title be the same as what the people would use for the blog, so that I don't have to train anyone on how to write excellent blog headlines. I just use a great webinar title that I know would also double as a great blog headline, and oftentimes that, almost without fail, will serve as a very fruitful and useful subject line for an email as well. So if you do again a monthly webinar, turn that into a blog. You can turn that into guest posts and drive yourself more links and more traffic, and get out more good content that way. But again, turn it into a blog article. Same content will be reused here. You can use the same lead-in that you did with the webinar. You can basically have that somewhat transcribed into a 2 or 3 sentence version and use that as the lead-in to your email. Cover a little bit of the content with a content snippet from your blog, and then go ahead and link over to the blog, or go ahead and link over to the webinar. So again, you're driving back to your original material because you're just recycling, reusing your original material. The key here that's important to bear in mind is Do you want to, first and foremost, what is your cadence? What is your cadence for content creation? And what is your rich content, which is videos, webinars, podcasts, etc., not just written word? What is your cadence for written content, which in my opinion should correlate pretty closely and directly to your rich content creation? And then what is your cadence for email? Once you have that decided, let's find a way to streamline your week by week educational email material, or your month by month, or your twice a week, whatever it is that your pace is. This is a way of basically taking your other content, which you thought out very well, and being able to either not have to use your brain to create your other pieces, or to be able to very easily delegate your other pieces, being your written content and your newsletters or emails, without really having to train anybody to be an expert marketer. So again, you don't have to rack your brain to develop great email content. You can essentially recycle and re-reference to your other rich and written content segments in order to essentially repurpose them and use the same great marketing thinking you used here and double its benefit here and double its benefit here. So hopefully this is a little bit of a useful tip for everybody. I think most folks have probably never thought of recycling their titles, and I know for sure I've hardly ever seen anybody recycle their lead-ins. But if you can create a really compelling lead-in to a video or a webinar or a podcast, and you're delegating newsletters, or you have to now go write a newsletter, if you did a great job nailing the lead-in for these pieces, isn't that just the perfect lead-in to incentivize a click in your newsletter as well? I think it pretty well darn should be. So hopefully that comes in handy for everybody out here. No matter what your content regimen is here, stay rigorous with it. Otherwise, your emails hardly ever will be. It's pretty indicative of how well and how rigorously you execute on your other content strategies. That's normally a great indicator as to how regular and how consistent and how rigorous you are with your email communication as well. And the good news is, as you can see here, they can feed off of each other in a way that really makes it not a lot of work. It actually makes it sort of just the simple repurposing of content you've already created. And at the same point, it ensures quality across the board. If you're hodgepodging your newsletter last second on Sunday night, and you're hodgepodging your blog because you just got to pump out a blog, really doesn't make it a system, and it really doesn't make it high quality. If you have a theme for this week where you have a great video that gets repurposed easily into a great blog because the video content's so great, then these two bits of content here now become the perfect fodder for a fantastic newsletter that you can send out to your folks. So we're focusing on quality, we're focusing on rigor, and we don't, luckily, have to focus on creativity more than once a week or once a month or whatever the case may be. So hopefully this comes in useful for everybody who's here on the call, and I look forward to catching you on the next CLB Boost tutorial.